Hi everyone, Nigel Saunders here. We're back for part 3 of my miniature avatar grove bonsai landscape. In part 2 of this series, I pruned up all the trees and I made the hill larger and I added more trees to the back of the planting. I was looking back at the work I did yesterday and I'm not sure about this sloping down to the edge of the pot. I kind of liked it before where there was a flat section and then it kind of came up like a cliff face. So I'll probably take away this soil in this part, making it flat again, and then having a bit of a hill coming up to the trees. I think the other side's fine. I may just reduce that slightly also. I'll start by raking away some of this soil here. I think that looks better. All right, let's have a look at it from the front now. I think I could take just a little bit more off here. Yeah, that looks better. I like that. I put a little bit of a ridge there, or a depression in the hill, and that looks more realistic. Okay, and I'm looking at the other side now. I think I'm going to do a bit of the same there. Maybe not quite as much, but just removing a little bit of that hill. Okay, yeah, I like that much better. It looked like it was bulging out of the pot before. It just looked too much soil mass for the size of the pot. My next step will be to plan the pathway going through the forest. You don't have to have a pathway going through your bonsai forest, but it adds an element of interest. It takes the viewer on a journey. They see this nice pathway that they could walk along, and they sort of mentally take the journey. They follow the pathway and imagine being there, looking up at the trees and discovering new plants and animals. Pathways are a natural part of any forest. Animals use them to get from one part of the forest to another part, so maybe to go to the lake to drink water, go to a stream, searching for food. So even the wildest forest will have pathways going through the forest floor. So I'm going to make this pathway flat so a person could walk on it. I envision a person in this planting to be very small, maybe that size. So the path doesn't have to be all that wide. I don't want to use many rocks in this planting because it is a large forest, and if I add a lot of rocks to it, it's going to get quite heavy and it become almost impractical to lift. Right now I can lift this forest and it's not that heavy. I can carry it around to the car and that kind of thing. So it's still a practical size. But if I were to add a whole bunch of rocks and stuff, it would get really heavy quickly, and I don't want it to be so heavy that 2 people have to lift it. Okay, I like that pathway, and it's going to come down here around the front. Now here I'll probably have to put some rocks or something so someone can walk up here. Sort of maybe steps. The real Avatar Grove in BC is quite steep, so yeah, this slope of this planting is quite close to the actual slope of the grove, I think. It's not easy to walk around in there. I usually use sand for my pathways, and I'll do that later on. I'm going to get all the moss in place first, and then I'll add the sand, so the sand kind of blends in with the moss. The next step, I'm going to start working on the base of this tree, cleaning away the moss to expose kind of the surface roots. Right now the moss is kind of growing up on top of all the roots and the root base. So I like the moss, but it's just starting to cover the base of the tree. So I'll clean that up. So I'll just come in with the tweezers and start picking the moss, kind of peeling it back. I need a little toothbrush here. That'll help kind of clean away the moss here. The ancient cedars get a really nice root base on them. I really like doing this type of work. All the little fine details in the forest to make it look giant. Kind creating a scale to the planting. I mean, it already has a scale now, you know. As I said, I imagine a person sort of this high. But adding all the moss and the rocks and fallen trees and details like that can really, really add to the scale of the forest, making it look like you're really there in a old growth ancient forest. Okay, I'm gonna get some water and wet this root base down. Just clean it up. And I'll get my toothbrush and keep scrubbing away. Getting the root base cleaned up is one more element that makes this tree look like a giant ancient tree. When a bonsai tree dies, most people just want to get rid of them, forget about them, out of sight, out of mind, but they can be useful for details in a forest. I have a branch here that was cut off a tree, and I'm going to show you how you can use dead trees in a forest planting. In the mountains, or in a forest that's on a slope like this, trees often fall down, and then they roll down the hill until they come to rest against the trunk of another tree. So sort of like this. Now, this isn't the final planting, but I'm just showing you an example how you can use a dead tree in a bonsai landscape. Another element I can add to the landscape is clumps of sedum. If you see it down here as a ground cover in my little spruce planting. So I think that would add to this forest. It would look like miniature bushes. And this is an outdoor forest, so the sedum would grow quite well, dying back every fall and then growing again in spring. And I think it can be controlled if you keep up with the pruning on it. It seems to be a manageable addition to a planting. Moss is also an excellent element to add to a landscape planting. If you see in my larch forest near the back, I've got 2 moss bushes. I've had those little clumps of moss growing at the back of my larch planting for over 4 years. When I repot them, I dig them up and transplant them. So that's something we'll be adding to this cedar planting for sure, is some nice shade moss like that. And I'll slowly work it over the years to shape it into like a small bush. My larch forest will be getting the same treatment that the cedar forest did. It'll be going into a large bonsai mica pot, the same size as the other one, but a slightly different color. It'll be a darker pot, so closer to a black color. I'm going to wait till midsummer, and I'm going to lift it out of the seed tray and put it in the new pot. I didn't do it this spring because I wanted to make sure all the roots weren't disturbed this year, because it was just repotted last year. So I wanted to make sure the forest came out into leaf, and then I'll repot it midsummer with very little root pruning. So it'll just be slip potting it into the new pot. And there'll be a lot of landscape work coming to the larch forest this summer. I'm back to the cedar forest now, and elements like, the tree that's fallen down and rolled down the hill, I'll be adding all those elements to the end. They'll be the final touch to the planting. So I've got to get all my moss and that in place first. My sedum, my moss. Any rocks I put in, there'll be small rocks if I do. No large rocks in this planting. As I said, it's heavy enough. Okay, so I think the next step is going to be adding moss to the planting. Especially to the top of the hill there. Yeah, anywhere that, the forest would get some sun. So not under the bases of the trees necessarily, but everywhere else. So I'm going to go up front to my sidewalk again and collect some moss. I'm out front of the house at the sidewalk of plenty. It provides me all the moss for my bonsai trees. So the moss just grows in these cracks in the sidewalk. So I just get my spatula and scrape it off like that. There's some weeds in this section, so you pull those out. So these cracks in the sidewalk, all the dust blows and fills them back in, and new moss grows in it. So there's always moss out front of my house. I've got the moss back and I want to wet it so it's a little more flexible so it can adjust to the contours of my terrain here. So this is a moss that's growing in full sun. So it does really well on most bonsai trees. In a forest like this, there's a lot of shade, and the moss in my larch forest is a shade moss. So I'm going to put some of that shade moss into this forest also. So we get a kind of a combination of the two. All the moss that grows in the full sun will be placed near the front of the planting where it does get a lot of sun. So covering up all that bonsai soil. We don't want to see that white perlite in here. There's a few roots out front here that I'm going to trim. They're kind of sticking out of the soil and there. So the trick to moss in a forest, if it's too even, it looks like someone's mowed the lawn. It looks too artificial. So you want clumps and, you know, varieties of moss, and as I said, we'll put the sedum in here. So I don't want to get, you know, too much of a front lawn here. So I got to be very careful how much moss I apply. Otherwise it starts to look like astroturf. You don't want that look in a natural forest. So I talked about a dry stream bed, and there is kind of a natural one that's formed down here. So I may make that a feature. A lot of people ask me about moss. Is it just a temporary thing used for bonsai shows? And I say no, you can leave it on all year round. You know, when you're watering the trees, you just have to do a pre-soak to wet the moss first, and then once the moss is damp or wet, the water flows through it freely. Like I said, my larch forest, that moss has been on for 4 or 5 years now. I've never planted new moss on it. It's always been the same moss. And both the trees and the moss are doing fine. I mean, it does go a little dry looking in summer. In the heat of summer, it is hard to keep moss staying green, but if you look at it like a seasonal change, in the summer your moss goes brown, and in spring and fall it looks lush and green. It's kind of the opposite of what your trees do. I did have a group of rocks that I had planted sort of like stepping stones coming down this hill here. So I'm going to add those back in. Last year all the birds kicked them away. These stones were just from the gravel driveway. I just picked ones that had sort of rectangular flat faces. So my path kind of comes down here, so I'm gonna put this stone right in there. And these are meant to look natural, so you know, they don't have to be rectangular looking stones. It's just to look like sort of a rock formation that you would walk down, which happens a lot in nature. You see sort of natural stepping stones. I'm not liking it, not yet anyway. I'm going to move this one maybe higher up here, and this one maybe here. I think I had them too far apart. Rake away a bit of soil here. Let's try a little bit of moss around them. That always kind of blends them in and makes them look more natural. Again, this is all just trial and error. You just see what looks good to you. If you like it, great. If you don't, change it. Moss always makes everything look better. I'm going to leave the center part of the planting, and I'm going to get this edge work done first, where I had kind of flattened the edges. So that, because it's out in the open, that can get a layer of moss on top of it. And I may add a few rocks to the edge to make kind of a cliff face there. I'm still a little high here. My moss would be higher than the lip of the pot, so I've got to take a little bit of soil away first. That looks about the right level there. Okay, so let's get some moss out and start planting it. Always push your moss down firmly so it makes good contact with your soil. If there's any air gaps between your moss and the soil, it'll just go brown and die quite quickly. Now an area like this would be a good place to plant sedum, so I'm going to do a bit of that also. Okay, let's get some sedum and some rocks and try and finish off this area. I've gotten a handful of gravel from the driveway that I'm going to use as my rocks. And in gravel driveways you can often find some very interesting rocks, small rocks, because a lot of rocks go through a rock crusher, so they're split open and they have some nice rugged features on them, which are perfect for this, size of landscape. So yeah, we just want to add a few rocks in here, not a whole lot, but just some to add some interest. It's always hard arranging rocks because you don't see what they look like until you get all the moss built up around them. So you just got to kind of imagine the rocks holding the cliff face up and just put them where you think they would be. That was a good start, but I'm doing some rearranging just to kind of bring the rock face out a bit, to kind of follow the contour of the pot more. I think that'll look good once it gets filled in with moss and soil. It should look pretty good. Let's try some moss in here now. Yeah, I think that'll look pretty natural. Like I said, these rocks, they're just small rocks from a gravel driveway, but in this planting, they become huge rocks. They become giant rock, or a giant cliff face, or a rock face, whatever you want to call it. As I'm working on this section of the landscape, I'm starting to be drawn into it, imagining it's becoming, full size to me almost. I can see all the details now, and it's becoming more realistic looking. And this happens as you work on your bonsai landscape. All the little details start coming together, and it starts to look really miniature. So I hope you can kind of see that in this planting, that it's starting to, look like a little miniature part of a forest. Especially when I pick all these perlite pieces out. They don't help give it a miniature look at all. I'm starting to detail the upper part of the hill now, adding moss. Yeah, this moss is a coarser moss. It was taken from the surface of those little cedar trees I added to the back. I saved the moss. So I'm just trying to break it up so I get, a variety of different styles of moss in here. I don't want it to look like a patchwork quilt where you have, patches of different colored moss everywhere. That never looks good to me. So now I'm going to borrow some shade moss from my larch forest and get some patches of that planted in here also. I'm going to put these clumps of shade moss back here, sort of like bushes on the top of the hill. Make sure they're planted well. And this stuff will spread. I mean, start with one little clump here and it sort of naturally sorts itself out. The sunlight moss, if it's too shady, will die off. And the shade moss, if it's growing well in the shade, it'll spread. There's one clump of it, and I'll put another clump back here. Just like that. You can't see much of it from the front here, but it's there. It'll grow nice and tall eventually. I have a lot of the moss on the hill now. It looks a little too even. There's too much moss, so I'm going to fix that later. I'm going to start roughing in the pathway here with some sand. This is just playground sand that you buy at the hardware store. I'm just going to start adding the pathway in here. And it kind of continues down the hill here a bit. A bit at the bottom down here. And kind of, the path kind of goes up here. On top here. Somewhere around there. And when I water this, a lot of it will get washed away, so you can't put too much sand on. It'll just wash away the excess. Alright, let's get out the watering can now and water it down. Alright, I'll start watering. You can see the sand flowing away. Okay. So that gives the sand a real natural look. I will have to scrape it away from the front here. So I'll continue adding moss. I don't want that path quite so defined. I want it a little more subtle. So I'll have some moss kind of in the pathway. And again, if you do this kind of work and you find in the end, I don't like it, it's too green or not enough moss, you can always change it. Nothing's fixed. I mean, it's just a matter of rearranging things. It's quite often you do this work and then, the next day you step back and look at it and say, oh, I like this part of it. I like that part of it, but I'm going to change this. And the pathway's looking a lot more natural now with a bit of moss in there. It kind of wanders through there. It looks, it's looking better. The landscape's making good progress. I'm happy with the pathway, the way it comes down at the front with the kind of the steps and the rocks and that. It looks very natural. So I've got to add my little dry stream coming down. So I'm going to collect a bunch of smaller rocks now and try and arrange them so it looks like a dry stream that runs down the mountain there. So I'll do that next. I've got a handful of pebbles here that I'm going to arrange to look like a dried up stream bed, something from the spring runoff. So I'll just place them in here. I'll just probably do this, just pour them kind of into the crack here. And you can see how they've naturally piled up against that fallen tree there. That makes it look very natural. I will push them in place just to make them a little more permanent so they don't roll down. Yeah, that's looking better. I'm going to work on the left side of the forest, the end here, adding moss and getting it looking good. I'm not going to be adding rocks to this end of the landscape because I don't want it to look exactly like the other end. I want a different look. As much variety as possible. Here's a shot of the progress so far. So it's starting to look quite realistic and miniature. I'm going to add the sedum next. That was one of our other elements we wanted to add. And then I'm going to also add some more fallen trees. I'll get some sedum from the front garden, bring it back, and I'll plant it in various places to look like small bushes. Here's the sedum I collected. Just little patches of it from the front garden. Alright, so I've got to determine where I'm going to put it. I think some right out front here would look good. I want to position the sedum kind of up front because it's a fairly large plant. It's not, and it's got to be in the sun out here, so if I put it back in the forest, I don't think it would do very well. It needs the good sunshine. Now, where else does it need some sedum? I would say on the left-hand side here. Instead of the rocks, we'll have a patch of sedum over here. Yeah, I think I've got a patch of sedum here. So I think it would look good over on this side, the left-hand side. The other side has the rocks, and this side could have a patch of sedum. So I'll move some of the moss that I've already planted here. And I'll position a clump of sedum in there. There's a good clump there. Don't want it too big a clump, so I think about that. I'll give it a water and just kind of get it settled in to this little spot here. That's looking good. And this will spread and I can trim it back to keep it under control and short and kind of miniature looking. I think I will put one patch of sedum over on the right hand side too. It'll kind of balance the composition. So I have a little clump here I can put in. And I'll put that right here, I think. Just move the moss out of the way. I'll put my clump of sedum in there. I'm stepping back now, looking at the overall planting. It's looking pretty good, I think. I do want to add some more fallen trees and branches. Most forest floors are quite littered with fallen debris and that. They don't look clean like it does now. So I'm going to snip some branches off some of my dead trees and see what I can find to place along the forest floor. I've got a collection of dead branches off a bonsai tree here. So I'll arrange them on the forest floor and try and make them look natural and not too distracting. If they start to look too distracting, I'll not use them, but I'll try it out. So here I go. I'm looking at the forest from the distance now. I'm trying to decide if I like all those branches or not. I do like some of them. I think maybe the ones at the front at the bottom are a little distracting. Let's see how that looks now. Yeah, I like that better. Kind of gives a natural look to it. If I don't like it, I can always take them away. But for now, I'm going to keep it. It kind of adds a realistic element to it. Again, big changes to the Avatar Grove today. I'll fly the camera around and we'll have a look at all the details. Tomorrow I'm heading off to the Toronto Bonsai Society's annual spring show. I'll put a link to the show in the description below. That's all for today. I'm Nigel Saunders. Thanks for joining me in the Bonsai Zone.